So I'm going to talk about on the prospects for post-quantum cryptography in TLS. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along. I can watch the chat or just raise your hand or unmute yourself. I'm happy to have some interaction. So I'm from the University of Waterloo, which is located near Toronto in Canada. We have a lot of work going on in our Cybersecurity and Privacy Institute, our Institute for Quantum Computing on cryptography, and a bunch of great colleagues who are also doing lots of interesting work in cryptography. So hopefully we'll get a chance to have many of you visit us at some point in time. So as some background, I think we're all pretty familiar with TLS on the web. So when you're visiting your favorite website, you have the lock icon in the top left, which is meant to indicate some kind of security. And when you dig into the details, you can see that it lists a bunch of algorithms that are being used, to protect the connection using TLS 1.3. So when we look at these algorithms, we see two main classes of cryptography: our public key cryptography. In this case, the Sophia's workshop website is protected using elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman key exchange using X25519. And although it's not listed here, elliptic curve signatures. And then the symmetric cryptography that is AES 128 with GCM for encryption and integrity. Great. And so when we look at the left part of this diagram, the public key cryptography and the TLS 1.3 handshake, we see a basic signed Diffie-Hellman type communication flow. So the parties do an ephemeral Diffie-Hellman key exchange, where the client generates an ephemeral key, transmits it to the server, and the server responds with its ephemeral key, G to the Y, and the computer shared secret, G to the XY. So that's for forward secrecy and ephemeral key exchange. And then there's also authentication, in this case, server to client authentication using a digital signature scheme, where the server has a long-term public key, and that's transmitted to the client inside of a certificate, as well as used to sign the transcript of communication to authenticate the server to the client. So that's TLS 1.3. And of course, the motivation for all of this workshop is the concern that the public key algorithms on the left-hand side are not resistant to attack by quantum computers. And so you might say that the solution then is simply to replace the non-post-quantum algorithms with post-quantum algorithms. So as you can see, I've scribbled on this diagram here. We could replace the Diffie-Hellman key exchange with a Chem. We could replace the traditional signature scheme with a post-quantum signature scheme. And then we'd be done. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you, everyone, for coming. But of course, there's a little bit more to say about that than just what I've shown here. So I want to talk about three things today. A little bit about the performance of the replacements that I talked about on the previous slide. A discussion about hybrid and standardization of hybrid algorithms, as well as a discussion of some alternative protocol designs. One that I'm involved in with a few people that are on this call, called Chem TLS. So first off, a little bit about benchmarking. This is some work that we presented last year at PQ Crypto. And it's about benchmarking, answering a certain benchmarking question of post-quantum algorithms in TLS. So the goal in particular was to measure the effect of network latency and packet loss rate on handshake completion time for post-quantum connections of various sizes. The motivation for this is that many of the post-quantum algorithms that we have as candidates are, from a CPU performance perspective, relatively comparable with our existing algorithms. But one of the main ways they differ is in the amount of communication they send. And so we wanted to investigate that. And so that was the focus of this particular task. There are other works that are measuring the effects of different CPU speeds on algorithm performance, and Dan Bernstein, who's in the chat, has the wonderful SuperCOT project. So there's lots of work being done on that. We want to specifically look at network latency and packet loss rate. And the motivation for this, in part, was some experiments done by Google and Cloudflare over the past few years, trying out various post-quantum candidates or post-quantum scenarios in some browser and server combinations. And it was this 2018 work that was of particular interest to me that I wanted to respond to. So in this 2018 work that Adam Langley and some of his colleagues at Google did, they modified the Chrome browser to send some dummy extensions with larger handshake packets to simulate this effect of size on connection establishment time. And at the time, it highlighted some problems with an algorithm that I was involved in with Frodo that has larger communication sizes compared to some of the other round 2 and round 3 algorithms. And so I wanted to try to replicate this, see if it was really true and what the effect was actually going on there. But the problem in replicating this was that I am not Google or Cloudflare, and I do not have billions of clients and millions of servers at my disposal. And so what we decided to do was do emulation. So we emulated the network and used some tools that I'll talk about on the next slide. But the effect of this was that we had a lot more control over the experiment parameters, and it was easier to isolate the effects of various network characteristics. The flip side of that, of course, is that because we're controlling the experiment characteristics and not just using the ones that exist in reality, we do have a loss of realism compared to what actual users experience. So I think it complements the earlier work. So we made use of some network emulation tools in Linux, where we can have the kernel create network namespaces with independent copies of the networking stack, and then use virtual Ethernet devices to connect these two, and instruct the network emulation module to perform certain transformations or certain modifications when packets are transmitted across these namespaces. In particular, we can introduce a delay, or we can drop packets with a specified probability. So this is the first of 2 tools that we used to carry out this experiment. The second was software that we developed as part of the Open Quantum Safe project. So as part of that project, we have a C library called libOQS, brings together in a single common API key exchange or CHEM algorithms and signature algorithms. Then we have integrations of these algorithms into forks of widely used open source projects, including OpenSSL, which is what we used in this experiment. And then modified applications like Apache and Nginx, Nginx being what we used in this experiment, that incorporate these algorithms. So we're able to do full client-server experiments using this toolkit. So in this experiment then, we had a bunch of clients using a module called STimer as part of OpenSSL, which were communicating with a bunch of Nginx servers and going through the Linux network emulation kernel. And in the middle here, I'm denoting that this experiment, this kernel, could modify the delay on packets, or it could drop certain packets with a specified probability. So with all that being said, let's take a look at the effect this had on performance of various algorithms. So I'm going to show you a sequence of charts, and I'm going to focus on key exchange. The story for authentication is kind of similar. So in this graph here, we're looking at the x-axis of the effect of packet loss rate, percentages from 0 to 20%, on the y-axis, handshake completion time from 0 to 800 milliseconds. And here I'm comparing 2 algorithms, plain ECDH with the NIST P256 curve, and in blue, a hybrid of NIST P256 combined with level 1 Frodo 640 AES. And so we can see that the performance of the performance in terms of network handshake completion time of Frodo and plain ECDH track very closely for packet loss rates up to about 8%. And we start to see a bit of divergence. And as we get to around 14%, we see a spike in the handshake completion time of Frodo, and it continues to stay elevated significantly compared to the elliptic curve NIST P256 key exchange. And this is on a connection with a very low latency round trip time of 5.6 milliseconds. If we increase the round trip time to 31 milliseconds, we can see that Frodo diverges from ECDH a little bit earlier, and this pattern persists as we increase the round trip time higher and higher. And I should note that on the bottom two graphs, the y-axis has changed. What we're seeing here is the effect of retransmission. So Frodo has about a 10 kilobyte communication size to establish a round trip, compared to, say, just a few hundred bytes for NIST P256. And so these 10 kilobytes get fragmented across a significant number of packets, usually at least 8 packets, if we're talking about a standard TCP transmission size. And so around 7 to 10 to 13%, if you have 8 packets, there's a decent chance that one of these packets is going to have to be retransmitted. And as soon as you have a retransmission, then you have a whole other round trip. So that's why we see these jumps in Frodo compared to ECDH. And so we are seeing a significant impact from larger communication sizes. Now, in the experiment, we also took a look at other post-quantum algorithms. I've added to the chart now the performance of Kyber and Psych, Psych having the smallest of the 3 post-quantum candidates shown on the graph here. Looking at the performance again, you can see that Psych starts off with a higher baseline, and this is because the CPU performance of Psych is slower compared to other algorithms. It has improved a bit since we did these experiments, and so Psych would be a little bit closer to the remaining lines at this point in time, but it would still have a slightly higher baseline compared to everything else. But you can see that Psych and Kyber spike their handshake completion time quite a bit later than Frodo, and this is because they have much smaller communication sizes. Psych basically can still fit in the same number of packets as an elliptic curve key exchange. Kyber has one larger packet, I believe. So that's the kind of the base story here. This is for the median connection, so the 50th percentile user experience. If you look at the 95th percentile user experience, we see a bit of a different story. We see that the algorithms remain much closer for much of the increase in packet loss rate, although Frodo does still spike dramatically so for a significant fraction of users. So although this is the 95th percentile, the flip side of that is it's still affecting 5 users, and 5% of users. And so for 5% of users on a trans-Pacific connection, we would see a significant impact perhaps on connection establishment time, if they have very poor network quality. So the conclusions from this are that on fast, reliable network links, then it's really the cost of the public key cryptography that's dominating the median TLS establishment time. And we're not seeing a whole lot of difference at, say, the 95th percentile establishment time. But on unreliable network links, even starting around 3%, the communication sizes come to govern handshake completion time. And we really see this dominating, especially past 10%. Now, of course, the flip side of this is as application data sizes grow, the relative cost of TLS handshake establishment time diminishes compared to application data transmission, but it can still be a significant cost for smaller connections. So this is a little bit of a picture on what type of performance we might expect as we switch to post-quantum algorithms. This is kind of the end of the first little blurb in the talk, and I'm going to move on to the next part, but I'm certainly happy to have any questions or discussions on this part before I move on. Okay, then let me move on to the next little thing I wanted to talk about, which was about hybrid key exchange. And this is in part based on a draft that I'm working on with Scott Fleur and Shai Garon that we submitted to the TLS working group. So perhaps you're already familiar with the idea of hybrid, or sometimes called composite. The idea here, at least in the way we're using the term in this setting, is to take a cautious approach to adoption, motivated by the idea that some proposed post-quantum solutions could be could be broken. We have less confidence in their security, perhaps, because some of the assumptions are newer. And so in the hybrid approach, one would use a traditional and a post-quantum algorithm simultaneously to reduce the risk during this transition period of uncertainty. And there's a second motivating factor, which I'll talk about on this next slide here, which is that it may also allow you to keep, or that you might temporarily need to keep traditional algorithms in place during a transition while you're waiting for certification of a new implementation. So we might have early adopters who want to get post-quantum security. NIST is expected to announce its selections from among the round 3 finalists next month. We're not quite in October yet. Excuse me. But it will still be, perhaps till 2024 that a final FIPS standard is fully approved. And then a couple years after that, before implementations have been successfully certified through the FIPS certification process. So in the meantime, early adopters might want to start using post-quantum algorithms because they're going to be well understood over the next couple of years, even if they're not fully certified. Yet they may have a need to keep their certification for compliance purposes with their regulators. And so one can imagine those users also wanting to employ a hybrid solution where they have a FIPS certified elliptic curve implementation combined with a quantum resistant algorithm from the NIST round 3 finalists. So the goal here is to permit simultaneous use of these traditional and post-quantum key exchange algorithms for at least one of these two purposes. So as part of this document, for standardizing in TLS, we have to define the data structures for negotiation of hybrid options, communication formats for the data to be transmitted, as well as the shared secret calculation to safely combine the shared secrets. In this particular document, we're not considering hybrid or composite authentication or digital signatures, although I'll briefly mention that in a few minutes. And we're also not focusing on selecting which post-quantum algorithms to use in TLS. So the goal is to look at data structures and combination options, but not specific algorithms. So what after a bunch of considerations for TLS, the idea that we've gone with is that each desired combination of a particular traditional and post-quantum algorithm will be assigned a new identifier. In TLS lingo, that's a new key exchange group. And these will be opaque objects. So you won't separately negotiate your traditional algorithm and your post-quantum algorithm. You'll just negotiate one fixed combination. So new named identifiers will have to be listed for each desired combination that's going to be standardized. Now, this does lead to a combinatorial explosion in terms of the number of identifiers that have to be standardized, but it reduces complexity in terms of implementations and being certain that the implementation achieves a certain security policy. In terms of the format for communicating this information, the key shares, the public keys and ciphertext, will simply be concatenated and transmitted together. This does lead to a little bit of duplication of transmission in some cases. Like if you want to propose both plain elliptic curve and elliptic curve plus Kyber, you'd actually send 2 copies of an elliptic curve public key. But again, this simplifies the overall complexity of the implementation. The current approach for shared secret calculation is to concatenate the shared secrets and then just input this into the key schedule. But I'll talk about this in a couple of slides as well, because it's something that we're reconsidering at the moment. Now, if you think about how to design a mechanism like this, there are a variety of other design options that you might come up with. And in our document, we kind of list all the different things we considered at each stage of the process. For a simple thing, combining 2 algorithms, there are actually surprisingly many things to consider. Do you want to be able to combine just 2 algorithms or at least 2 algorithms? Some people propose that you should be able to hybrid together 3, 4, 5 algorithms if you want to for additional security. At this point in time, we've decided to go with just 2. But that is, an objection we get every time this document comes up from certain people. We also considered a few options in terms of how to convey information in the key shares, but I don't think I'll say much about that. It's really engineering detail. From a cryptography perspective, there are some interesting questions on how you should combine the shared secret. So I mentioned that we're just concatenating. An alternative approach would be to apply some key derivation function before inserting the result into the key schedule. Or you could XOR the two shared secrets, or you could insert them into different parts of the TLS key derivation function to make use of these existing structures. And there are benefits and drawbacks to each of these. We went with concatenation for two reasons. One is because it's simple, and the other is because it is approved by NIST. So in particular, what we're doing is we're saying that the shared secret we pass to the TLS protocol is just the concatenation of the shared secret from the first key exchange algorithm, say ECDH, and the second key exchange algorithm, the post-quantum algorithm. Or because there's a hash function along the way, you can think of it as eventually hashing these two before being used as a shared secret. And one motivation for this, as I said, is that concatenation is a hybrid method that has been approved by NIST. So in SP 856C revision 2, NIST officially says that if you have an approved method like ECDH and a non-approved method like a post-quantum algorithm, is it acceptable to construct a hybrid shared secret simply by concatenating the two values. And so if we take this approach, we maintain the FIPS compliance of an implementation that uses ECDH along with something else. And you can prove that this is a satisfactory combination method under a variety of different assumptions. So if we assume that at least one of the two contributing keys, K1 or K2, is indistinguishable from random, then in the random oracle model, for example, if H is a random oracle, then it's easy to show that this shared secret is indistinguishable from random. If you want to work in the standard model, if you assume that K1 and K2 are fixed length, and the function H is modeled as a dual pseudorandom function, meaning that in either half of its input, it acts as a good pseudorandom function, then the shared secret is also indistinguishable from random. My lights just flickered. Am I still here? Okay, good.
You're still here, yes.
Okay, great. Right. So now these are we can prove it under these assumptions. Now, of course, our real hash functions are not random oracles, and in fact, our real hash functions have not had any properties of dual PRFs proved about them. So there is a bit of a gap here. And there's a post last month to the TLS mailing list by Avaram and others at ETH Zurich, pointing out that if the hash function is not collision resistant, then concatenating secrets may be dangerous. In particular, they point to an attack, well, a couple of attacks that have been seen in the past, one on a protocol called APAP, and another one in TLS called the crime attack, which basically allows the adversary to attack and recover bytes of K2 if K1 is adversary controlled, variable length, and H is not collision resistant. Now, although they pointed out this attack in the context of the hybrid combiner, it actually does apply to other parts of the TLS 1.3 key schedule as well. If you look into the details of how, for example, pre-shared key material is combined with ECDH material. We're currently discussing the impact and mitigation. At this point, it seems like the attack doesn't directly apply because all of the arguments that we're talking about in this setting are fixed length. So the ability to control the length of elements is critical for this attack to carry out. Nonetheless, we might still make some revisions, for example, switching to using a key derivation function to combine K1 and K2 rather than directly concatenating, but that's still something we're discussing. So something that seems as simple as hybrid key exchange is actually more complex than one might think in practice. Now, I did want to mention one other aspect of hybrid or composite algorithms. I'm not involved in this, but I did think it's worth mentioning because it's come up in some of the other talks that I've given on hybrid key exchange. And this is about hybrid authentication and hybrid certificates. So there is work being done in the ITF in the LAMPS working group, led by Mike Owensworth and Massimiliano Paolo from Cable Labs and Entrust Data Card. I'm not involved in this, I'm just including this because I think it's worth knowing about. So LAMPS is a working group focused on limited additional mechanisms for PKIX and SMIME. Basically, the IETF no longer had an X509 certificate working group, but they needed to do some extra stuff, and so they created this more narrow-focused working group called LAMPS, and that's where X509 work is being done these days. And so Mike and Massimiliano have proposed some drafts related to composite, that's the word they use for hybrid, composite keys and composite signatures and encryption, which then leads to composite X509 certificates. So they have a few different drafts there for these different purposes that are currently under consideration for standardization with LAMPS. Now, one interesting thing that they've identified in this work on composite keys and signatures is how one should interpret a composite key. So if I give you a certificate with 2 public keys in it, and you retrieve the certificate from me and try to do something with it, how should you interpret the certificate? Am I indicating to you that I want both of these algorithms to be used? So in the case of key exchange or encryption, I want it to be encrypted under both of these algorithms. Or in the case of signatures, I mean that you should only accept something if it's signed by both of these algorithms. So I'm asking for extra security. Or am I indicating to you that either algorithm is used, and I'm creating a single credential containing both to maximize backwards compatibility in a transitional setting? In that case, for signatures, I would be trying to tell you it's okay if only one of these algorithms is used, and you get to decide at verification time which one you're expecting to rely on. And it's not clear, a priori, what credential with 2 public keys is meant to be used. So in their documents, they've actually introduced the concept of composite and or composite or. So they'll explicitly encode in the certificate that one of these 2 settings is meant to be used. And so you'll be able to tell from this certificate which security scenario is intended. We don't need this in the composite key exchange that I discussed earlier in TLS, because the semantics of it already define that it's composite and that we're having to use both of these algorithms. And this is because TLS is a negotiated protocol. If you wanted to negotiate for the purposes of key exchange, only doing one of these 2 algorithms, what composite or is trying to express here, then the negotiation mechanism TLS already allows you to do that. This is also why it's not clear to me that composite certificates will actually play a role in TLS. So in the normal TLS flows, you do get to negotiate what authentication methods you use. And so it won't be necessary, I think, to convey a certificate containing composite or public keys in TLS, because you'll have been able to negotiate in advance that you, in that setting, that you actually just wanted to use, say, ECDSA, or that you wanted to use just dilithium. There won't be a need to convey both of these. Although I guess someone might still want to do that if they don't want to manage the complexity of obtaining multiple certificates. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on composite and hybrid. I'm happy to take discussion here before I move on to the last part on new protocol designs.
Any questions so far for Douglas? I do have actually a question, because right now there's a standardization process on a hybrid way to do the key exchange part of TLS 1.3, but has there been a consideration to do a hybrid authentication method for TLS 1.3?
So it's not something I've been pushing for, and I haven't seen any documents come forward on that. I think the reason for that is twofold. The first motivation is that there's a concern about retroactive decryption, or the harvest and decrypt attack. The idea that an adversary who doesn't have a quantum computer today could still be recording today's conversations, and in however many years, when they have a quantum computer, could come back and decrypt the things that they recorded passively today. And that is resolved by using hybrid key exchange. But for authentication, where we're using signatures, you can't retroactively go back in time and break authentication once you have today's sessions when you have a quantum computer in 20 years. So it seems like the more urgent need for secure channel establishment is composite key exchange. For other settings, say digitally signing documents, digital notaries, etc., they may have a long-term requirement on the authentication security. So they may have a more urgent interest in composite digital signatures. But for secure channels like TLS, that does not seem to be as urgent a need. And then the second reason why I don't think it's come up is, again, the negotiated aspect of TLS means that it is less needed, I think there's less of a role for composite authentication because you can negotiate which one you actually want to use at this particular moment.
Thank you very much. Any question for Douglas at this point also? Well, if not, we can continue. Thank you, Douglas.
Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in this space is the idea of alternative protocol designs. And this is work that I started with Peter Schwab and Tom Wiggers, and Tom's in the chat in the call today. And we've also continued with Sophia and Nick from Cloudflare in preparing a draft for the consideration by the ITF. So we're trying to consider here an alternative protocol design for authenticated key exchange, the goal of which, as you know, is for two parties to establish a shared secret over a public communication channel. And there's a vast, vast literature on AKE protocols. You could write a whole book on it, although I think that's a painful process. But there's a variety of security definitions, different credentials that can be used for authentication, different security goals, different protocol functionality, and there's many real-world protocols that are centrally based on authenticated key exchange. But the distinction I want to explore in this part of the talk is on the distinction between explicit authentication and implicit authentication. So in explicit authentication, Alice receives an assurance during the protocol that she really is talking to Bob, that Bob is live and on the other end of this connection. Whereas in implicit authentication, Alice doesn't quite get that assurance. She is assured that only Bob would be able to compute the shared secret that they're computing, but she doesn't necessarily have a guarantee that Bob has actually done so and is live on the connection right now. And there are some prototypical examples of this. So for explicit authentication, we've already seen signed Diffie-Hellman, and I've just replayed that or given another version of that in this diagram here. In this case, a mutually authenticated signed Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So we have an ephemeral key exchange using Diffie-Hellman shared secrets, exchanging G to the X and G to the Y. And then signatures. Each party has a long-term signing key, and during the exchange, they sign using their corresponding secret key, the transcript of communications, and their peer verifies before accepting the shared secret. Once they've accepted the shared secret, they have an explicit guarantee that their intended peer was actually live and communicating with them. So that's explicit authentication, and this is what we have in TLS 1.3 and many other protocols at the moment. Contrast this with an implicitly authenticated key exchange protocol like double Diffie-Hellman. So in this example here, we still are doing an ephemeral Diffie-Hellman key exchange with fresh Diffie-Hellman key shares every time, but we also have a static Diffie-Hellman key exchange going on, where each party's long-term key is a Diffie-Hellman public key, not a signature public key, and they compute a shared secret based on their long-term public keys. So combining Bob's long-term public key with Alice's long-term secret key, or vice versa, and then combining this with the ephemeral Diffie-Hellman key to make a single shared secret. At the end of this key exchange, Alice and Bob will have session keys that only Alice and Bob could compute, But Alice has no guarantee that Bob was actually the person who sent her Y and that computed the shared secret. So only Bob could compute the shared secret, but Alice has no guarantee that actually he has. So this is the motivation we're going to use for our redesign of the TLS handshake. And the motivation for why we'd want to do this is that post-quantum signatures are big. At least they are bigger than post-quantum key encapsulation mechanisms. So if we compare the sizes of these two things, I've listed a few post-quantum signature schemes from the round 3 finalists, as well as XMS. And we can see that we have fairly large public keys and signatures for dilithium and falcon. And while among XMSS and Rainbow, one of the elements is small, the other is still larger, at least compared to our RSA and elliptic curve algorithms that we're used to. If we plop in our post-quantum key encapsulation mechanisms, we can see some desirable characteristics compared to the signature schemes. So if we compare, say, the module LWE Kyber Chem compared to the dilithium signature scheme, we can see that Kyber is smaller, both in terms of public key and ciphertext, compared to dilithium's public key and signature. If we look at the isogeny-based key exchange algorithm Psych, then we can see it also has small public keys and ciphertexts compared to most of our post-quantum algorithms. And we also do observe some algorithms that have extreme trade-offs. As we saw with Rainbow for signatures, we have a similar trade-off with classic Maclise, with a small ciphertext but a large public key. So the goal in this work is to explore the trade-offs that can be had by replacing post-quantum chems, which in some cases have smaller components compared to post-quantum signatures. And this is what we've done in what we call the Chem TLS protocol. So I'll walk you through the basic Chem TLS protocol handshake, which is a candidate replacement for the TLS 1.3 signed Diffie-Hellman handshake. So we're still going to have a chem for ephemeral key exchange. The client will generate a temporary chem public key, transmit that to the server, and the server will encapsulate against that using fresh values to create a one-time ciphertext and a ephemeral shared secret. It's authentication that's different. Okay. So in this protocol diagram here, I'm showing you the server authenticated version. So in this case, server to client authentication will be based on a chem rather than a signature scheme. So the server will have a long-term public key that is a chem public key, and they will obtain a certificate from a certificate authority containing this chem public key. Now, I should note that the certificate will still have signatures in it rather than because we still need the certificate authority to use a signature to sign the certificate. But the key that it is signing, the server's public key, is a chem public key. Having received the chem public key, the client will encapsulate against that, transmit the chem ciphertext to the server, and then they'll jointly compute a shared secret based on the ephemeral chem public key as well as the long-term chem shared secret. And this is an implicitly authenticated protocol, at least at the point of this application flow immediately below the red part, because at the time of this application flow from the client to the server, the client is assured that only the intended server would be able to decrypt the corresponding ciphertext, but is not guaranteed at this point in time that the server is actually live. TLS and Chem TLS do later contain key confirmation messages, which have a MAC using the shared secret over the transcript. And at that point in time, the client does get explicit authentication of its peer's identity. But at least in the first application data flow shown here, it's only implicitly authenticated rather than explicitly authenticated. So this is the main protocol design. There are lots of things to consider based on this. One has to consider the different algorithms that are going to be used for all of these public key components. And there are actually 4 things that you can consider. there's the Chem that's used for ephemeral key exchange. And for that Chem, we want a small public key and a small ciphertext, because that is going to be transmitted in every connection. There's the Chem that we use for authenticated key exchange. And we also want it to have a small public key and small ciphertext, because that's also going to be transmitted, at least at this point, in every key exchange. We're imagining that for certification, there's an intermediate certificate and a root certificate, which is the most common scenario, I think, for most websites on the internet. For the intermediate certificate authority, we still do prefer to have a small public key and a small signature. But for the root certificate authority, we can make use of a trade-off where we only need a small signature. And this is because the public key of the root certificate authority, the trust anchor, has to be installed already on the client device. Otherwise, there's no root of trust. So we're not actually transmitting the root CA's public key. And so, with all these different constraints, we can try for different trade-offs and explore the parameter space. So I'm going to show you a graph with some results, some experimental results of 4 different scenarios. The first scenario, where we want to minimize the total transmission size, regardless of computation time. And in the scenario where intermediate certificates are transmitted. And then a second version, we're assuming intermediate certificates are cached, because this is an option in some deployments. And then 2 more scenarios where we focus on the particular assumption used. One where we're assuming that n-true-based assumptions are used. Another, we're assuming that module learning with errors assumptions are used, because we do have post-quantum signature and Chem finalists under each of these 2 assumption families. Okay, so let me walk you through some of the experimental results. So there's a lot going on in this graph here. On the x-axis, I'm showing the size of public key objects transmitted, so the Chem public keys and ciphertexts, and the signature public keys and ciphertexts as required. On the y-axis, I'm showing you the time required until the client receives its first encrypted application data response from the server. In the web browser setting, this is basically the point at which the browser can start rendering the page. And this is a good measure of latency experienced by clients, by users. So we've got a bunch of dots here. This first blue dot here, labeled lowercase ERRR, is the base scenario for non-post-quantum, the RSA and curve 25519. Tanya, I do see your question in the chat. Let me finish explaining this graph, and then I'll come back to your question in a moment. So the baseline here is comparing against the RSA 2048 as the server certificate, as well as CA certificates, and ECDH with X25519 as the ephemeral key exchange. Okay, so let's compare with one particular scenario where we're using module LWE for our cryptographic primitives. So the blue dot here represents signed Chem key exchange. So we use Kyber as our key exchange and dilithium as the authentication algorithm for the server. That's the second letter D here, as well as the intermediate certificate authority and root certificate authority. If we compare that with Chem TLS, where we replace the dilithium authentication for the server with Kyber authentication in Chem TLS, we can see a substantial decrease in the size of public key objects transmitted, nearly a 2 kilobyte decrease, as well as a slight decrease in the time until the client receives application data. The reason it looks like a very slight decrease here is because the time in this experiment is really dominated by the number of round trips that are needed to establish a session, although there is a slight decrease from the more efficient Kyber compared to dilithium. If we switch to the n-true assumption, we can see that there's much less of a difference between the size of objects in Falcon and n-true. So we see not much of a difference in the size of objects transmitted, although a small decrease both in the size of objects transmitted and in the total latency. And then in the third scenario here, where we want to minimize total communication size regardless of computation time, we would make a very different selection of algorithms in the post-quantum setting. In a signed Chem setting, we would choose Psych for the Chem, Falcon for the server certificate, XMSS for the intermediate certificate authority, and Rainbow for the root certificate authority, because this happens to minimize the overall communication size. And when we switch to Chem TLS, we could reduce communication size further by using Psych for server authentication, although that would increase communication total latency a little bit more because of the increased computation costs of Psych. So a lot of data that I've thrown at you in this single graph, but it conveys a mixed scenario for Chem TLS, I would say. If we happen to be standardizing on modulo LWE, then there is a significant improvement in size of public key objects transmitted. Not so much if we end up standardizing n-true based assumptions. And if we really want to minimize communication sizes, if we're in a scenario where communication is much more expensive than computation, then we can actually, with a certain choice of algorithms, get to, excuse me, something that is almost approaching, the sizes that we have now. In the paper, we also have some additional data on the scenario where we imagine the certificates, the intermediate certificate authorities are cached. Let me pause here for a moment if you have questions. And also take a moment to answer Tanya's question. So Tanya asked on this earlier slide why we don't send the hash of the public key instead of the public key for the long-term key. So I guess you're asking here why we're not transmitting the hash of the server's public key for in this line here. I mean, the certificate, for example, could involve solely the hash of the server's public key for the purposes of authentication, but there still would need to be a transmission of the server's public key to the client at some point in time in order to allow the client to actually encapsulate against it. So it is a necessary transmission, at least if I'm understanding your question correctly. Feel free to say if I've misunderstood your question. If there are other questions at this point in time, feel free to ask. So Tanya's clarified, assuming the client communicates with the server frequently. So yeah, so if we have a cached scenario, then things are entirely different. But for the typical scenario on the web right now, we don't have caching. And as Baz points out in the chat, then we would also be able to use session tickets if we assume the client communicates with the server frequently, and we could revert to pre-shared key. I do actually want to talk about the caching going on a little bit later. That'll motivate a second work. So maybe we can save some of that for discussion as well, because I think there are lots of interesting questions to discuss there. Any further questions or comments before I move on? Yeah, so as Sophia pointed out, there's a caching mechanism precisely for this in TLS 1.2. Okay, so to maybe comment just a little bit more on Chem TLS, there are several benefits. I think I've mentioned that with size optimized Chem TLS, we can achieve less than half the communication size of size optimized post-quantum signed Chem versions of TLS. And if we aim for speed optimized, although it didn't show on the graph that I showed you, in some scenarios, we can do with substantially fewer server CPU cycles and still reduce communication sizes. And this is because for some of our algorithms like n-true, key exchange is much faster than the corresponding Falcon signing. In this scenario here, we have no extra round trips required until the client starts sending application data. And we also reduce the size of the trusted code base because we don't need signature generation in real time on the client or server. There are some drawbacks as well. There are some subtleties involving several of the security properties. I'm not going to take the time to go into those, but there are subtleties in terms of authentication. I already mentioned the implicit versus explicit authentication properties. This also leads to some subtleties in downgrade resilience of the first application flow. And those are some things worth considering. It also has a drawback, at least Chem TLS has a drawback, if we're talking about the mutual authenticated version, in that we will require an extra round trip until the client starts sending application data if we're doing mutual authentication. And this is because we do require, in Chem-based authentication, an extra round trip before the server can have an implicit shared secret with the client, as opposed to signed flows, where we have explicit authentication of the client right in that first flow. So this is leading to a variant that we developed called Chem TLS SPDK, where we're assuming pre-distributed public keys. So if we do imagine that server public keys are pre-distributed because they're cached in the browser, or they're pinned in a mobile app, or embedded in an IoT device, or distributed through some out-of-band mechanism like DNS, then we can do better. Okay? And as as Sophia points out, there are actually mechanisms in TLS now, the cached information extension, that allow for explicit mention of this caching mechanism. Now, you might object that TLS 1.3 already supports pre-shared symmetric keys, so why should we consider pre-distributed public keys? Well, pre-shared symmetric keys, one might argue, are a harder key management problem, because we have to assume that the client gets a copy of this key, and it has a different compromise model, that we're assuming that this secret keying material is not compromised on either party. If we only have to pre-distribute public keys, there's a different key management problem and a different compromise model that can be beneficial in some settings. If we want to imagine cached or pre-distributed public keys embedded in IoT devices, this presents some different interesting trade-offs. And this is something that, among other things, Dan pointed out earlier in some discussions on mailing lists, that classic McLeese, for example, becomes competitive and interesting if we imagine pre-distributed public keys. So that's what Chem TLS SPDK tries to investigate, an alternative protocol flow where server certificates are known in advance. And the main benefits of this are some additional bandwidth savings in certain settings, that it makes some post-quantum algorithms viable, algorithms that have large public keys, like classic McLeese. It leads to client authentication one round trip earlier if the client proactively sends its credential. And it also leads to explicit server authentication one round trip earlier, improving this downgrade resilience subtlety that I mentioned earlier. Because I'm running late on time, I don't think I'll go into the numerical details of this, but we've got a table in our paper that talks about some of this, and there's a nice follow-up paper by Sophia and Tom and others that does some experimental investigation of this. Some nice security properties. There's some anonymity properties that are nice in this setting, and as well as some deniability properties, because we're not using signatures for authentication. I do want to mention that there's lots more going on, that the TLS ecosystem is really very complex. There's all kinds of things that I haven't touched on and that I don't even know a whole lot about, like datagram TLS, so TLS for UDP connections, the use of TLS handshakes and other protocols like Quick, and application-specific behavior like HTTP3, which actually does send something in an earlier flow that I hadn't anticipated. If we're going to start using Chem public keys, and we want these to be certified, then we have to consider what certification of Chem public keys is like. And there's some subtleties there that we're working on. And there's, of course, the long tail of implementations and middle boxes that can screw things up in the TLS ecosystem. I think it is really interesting to consider Chem public key certificates, and in particular, the question of how you might prove possession of such a secret key for a corresponding Chem public key. We know how to do this well for signature-based algorithms. For public key encryption or Chem-based algorithms, it's a little bit trickier. We can do interactive challenge response protocols, and this is well understood. And we can send the certificate encrypted back under the subject public key, although I think this is a little bit weird and relies on a non-standard security property. What's more challenging is to do a non-interactive certificate signing request, because chems are not a signature scheme. And so, a priori, we don't have this non-interactive version of a chem. We are doing some work to try to build a signature scheme from the chem operation following a picnic-like construction. This won't result in a great signature scheme. It's not something that I'm arguing you should use. You should not use Kyber-based signatures in place of dilithium signatures in general. You get public keys and signatures that are, so you get signatures that are bigger and slower than dilithium. But if you needed to do a non-interactive certificate signing request once to prove that you possessed the corresponding Kyber secret key, our early investigations demonstrate that this is viable and practical with not too large signatures around 227 kilobytes. And hopefully we'll be communicating more about this in the not too distant future. So that kind of sums up some of my thoughts on integrating post-quantum cryptography into TLS. So I'm happy to discuss more, including on isogenies, which I guess is the topic of this school, because I didn't get a chance to say much about non-interactive key exchange, which I probably should have. But I'll stop here. I'll stop for questions and discussion, and I look forward to chatting with you.
Thank you very much, Douglas. That was a really amazing talk, and always love to talk about TLS. I did have an isogeny question. I don't know if you consider the SQI sign new signature scheme for isogenies, and if you will make it for TLS.
Okay, so no, we haven't actually considered that, and I think it's definitely interesting. I had motivated this one Chem TLS scenario where we wanted to absolutely minimize communication sizes regardless of computation costs. And I guess that is a scenario where we should consider the impact of ski sign, because if memory serves, and I haven't studied it in detail, we can get small public keys and very small signatures, but at the cost of a multi-second signing and a sub-second verification if memory serves.
Yeah.
So, if we really were in a scenario where communication size was the absolute thing we needed to minimize, I think it's worth considering ski sign. But I haven't done any experiments on that, so probably we should.
Yeah, that's also something that I was thinking. And also maybe provide a good assurance of the security properties of it, which has been debated sometimes for isogenies. I don't know if someone else have another question. You can either mute yourself or put it in the chat, and I try to read it for you. Oh, wait just a little bit. Oh, I see Bas. Maybe Bas is thinking of a question.
I actually have a question about the first part, your measurement of network performance. Yeah. So you use fixed packet drop rates. I'm not very sure whether that's close to how in real life, because TCP gauges congestion by looking at when packets are dropped. And if you have a packet drop rate of 20%, then every 5 packets, it will think, oh, I need to throttle back. So have you tried to measure the actual bandwidth you get over the emulated connections? Because I don't think it will be very high.
Okay, so I mean, to specifically answer the question, no, I don't think we measured the emulated bandwidth of such a connection. That being said, I just want to make it clear, it's not it's not like explicitly saying I will drop every 5th packet. It's probabilistically deciding on every packet whether to drop it or not. I don't know if that affects what you're asking about.
No, it should still be very bad if still, if you probabilistically drop every 1 in 5 packets, I think you will have very bad performance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is what we saw. Now, I mean, with dropping 1 every 5 packets, it takes 12 seconds. Well, it takes even 4 seconds just to establish a plain TLS connection on a transcontinental connection, and it would take 12 seconds with Frodo. So, like, that is a really, really bad connection. When we were setting this up, we actually didn't have a whole lot of good data to know what reasonable packet loss rates were. Perhaps a large content distribution network has more insightful data on that than I do. The only data we could find to motivate this was actually some telemetry data from Mozilla about the observed packet loss rate in their WebRTC connections. And they're showing a frequency frequency chart here, where the x-axis is, let me get this right, tenths, like decipercents. So 10 here is indicating a 1% packet loss rate. I don't know why they multiplied by 10, but they did. And so you can see, at least in the data that they were collecting on desktops, it's a very, very, most people have very high connections. This is the only experimental data that we could find to inform our experiments.
Does it answer for you, Bas? Sorry. Okay, you're muted, I think, though, but okay.
If you have more insights, then I'd certainly be happy to hear them, because it's not something I'm an expert on. So question in the chat, is that data collected client side for telemetry? So my understanding is yes. So a small fraction of installations collect this data and on the client side, and then report it back to Mozilla telemetry servers, and then they report that. So wouldn't it skew based on high connectivity? So I mean, I think the reporting of the connectivity is done over a reliable connection. So I think that addresses that. As Tom points out, this is not necessarily representative because it is desktop and it is nightly, which means that it is used by advanced users who may be on better connections, and it's desktop connections rather than mobile. So this is the best data I could find. If you have better data, I would love to know it, but I don't. Mobile will certainly be different.